In this episode, we will learn how to build and scale a software business in the medical cannabis industry, and then after that, start a SaaS business for the private equity industry. My name is Alexei, and I help SaaS founders scale. This is one of my favorite episodes because I'm joined by Tony Lewis, the founder and CEO of ThinkChain.ai. ThinkChain.ai is a SaaS tool leveraging AI for the private equity industry. Tony had a fascinating career going from finance to Stanford, launching Confident Cannabis, which was backed by FJ Labs, Founders Fund, and YC, and then leaving the US, coming back to the UK, and launching ThinkChain.ai. In this episode, we also discuss how to launch a business with a couple of co-founders, how to find co-founders or a co-founder, and then also how to evaluate them. And then ultimately, Tony being a solo entrepreneur now, how does it compare to be alone versus with a bunch of co-founders? So enough of me rambling now, let's dive in. Hey Tony, excited to have you here.
So let's be here.
Awesome. Cool. So for context, you had an amazing career in finance and then went to Stanford. You got an idea there to launch a lab testing software for medical cannabis in the US. And you were then YC backed, FJ Labs backed you as well, and Founders Fund backed you. And you grew that business to a fairly huge business. And in 2021, you came back to the UK, played around with a bunch of different business ideas, co-founders, and ultimately launched what is now ThinkChain, correct?
Yeah, that's a great summary. Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. So I guess before we jump straight into ThinkChain, which is almost like you growing from, let's say, a bit of tech, then finance, then tech again, and now you're actually going into tech serving to finance. So it's a really interesting journey. Let's maybe quickly discuss also the journey of the medical cannabis lab testing software, because I don't think there are many people who know how to grow a business in a highly regulated industry, where basically the government, the payment processes, and the ad platforms are an enemy of yours. So let's maybe spend a few minutes on that first. So could you just give us some background how being in Stanford and having the option to always go back to a highly paying finance career, why did you decide to launch that business, and then how did you scale it?
Yeah. I guess the thing about Stanford, first of all, as a university, which is really different, certainly to UK universities, certainly to my experience at Oxford, is it's a very it's very much a hands-on, go do it, almost why haven't you done it already mindset, which is very compelling as somebody. So obviously I already had a bunch of experience investing in companies, learning about business models. And I did think of myself already as quite entrepreneurial, but I was also conscious that entrepreneurialism was within bigger organizations. Stanford kind of forces you to, you do an experiential course. And the experiential course literally is, did you interview 20 customers this week or not? You do more work between the classes than you do actually in the class. So what happened was I was working. I actually went to Stanford with about 3 or 4 different ideas of things that I wanted to test, different hypotheses. I was working initially on a football idea, so taking five-a-side football and bringing it to the US. So people are already doing that, and actually the business model probably doesn't work brilliantly. But and there's lots of interesting ideas in soccer in the US overall. And then I basically started working with a team. So there were 4 of us working on. Actually, there were 5 of us originally working on medical cannabis as an idea, because the regulatory environment was just exploding at that point. All this stuff was happening really, really quickly. From a European perspective, this stuff all seems very alien. But in California, 2015, you're talking about Washington and Oregon just suddenly creating these sort of really big markets. Colorado, you have these sort of big conferences already starting to happen. One of the first conferences that we did was in San Francisco. I think it was in January 2015, or maybe it was in December even, called The Science of Cannabis. And it was like in a basement in a hotel. There were only maybe sort of 100 or so people there, but this was literally like the beginning of something which is obviously going to be absolutely huge. And the opportunities were just endless. The regulatory resistance and all these different structural problems were always a big deal. But the thing is that they also created their own sets of opportunities. So there was always a thing around like, how do you build into this regulatory structure rather than do you necessarily get around? And that's how the lab software really came up, because we just kept meeting these labs who were, getting started. I think I maybe spoke to the first lab from a LinkedIn outbound in it was like sort of November 2014. And these were small business owners who were building things and they just had no support. And then, of course, the interesting thing about them was they were being created by the regulations. The regulations was creating this whole industry. So we just started building software for them. I was like, this seems like a really interesting area. We worked through the Stanford class with a guy called Professor Rohan, I think he's exited like 10 businesses, but he's also a professor at PhD. And he, extremely well networked guy. He was already, I think, 90 by the time we did his class. I think he might have retired now, but he was still going like into mid 90s. Just an incredible mind, right? And just the kinds of things he had done was really. So he did, for instance, like he did a roll up of ISPs back in, I think, the sort of the mid 90s maybe, and made a ton of money. He could have made even more, but some other people were doing it competitively. And the stuff was like that. So it's just like, go do it, talk to people, start to build something. Can you sell it? Go to a conference, just try, iterate. And there's 3 or 4 different ways that you can do that. So Lean Launchpad is very famous. It's another course, and Startup Garage is really famous. But we did Idea to Launch, which was Professor Ryan's class, and it was amazing. So then we did Y Combinator, and that was really cool. We weren't quite in the 2012, 2013 era where everybody was a unicorn, but we were early enough to mean that we worked closely with Paul Graham. And Jessica Livingston was one of our batch partners, and met Sam Altman and worked with him a little bit, although he was a little bit more sort of hands off, and just learned a huge amount about how you can, start something, build something people want, and then try and scale it. So really great experience. The industry is quite challenging, but mainly what we were trying to do was find opportunities. But then in the end, you do hit a lot of these frictions. It's very regulated. Yeah. Tax system is kind of strange. No one has any money. Getting paid is hard. Lots of lessons from that.
Makes sense. And just on that, in terms of scaling, right? Like, how did you grow there? Was it like a lot of just direct reach out?
Yeah, direct reach out. So one of the interesting things about selling into an industry which issues licenses is that there's a lot of information provided about license holders through state systems. So you can monitor those state systems. In the end, we built scrapers basically just to find new license lists when they were published, get the list of various different people, because we sold to different license types as well, because we had a few different products. But basically, in the end, the reality became, because we were the market leader, we got a lot of inbound. Because if at the point where someone's thinking, I'm interested in creating a laboratory, they Google it, and then we were pretty high on SEO, but all organic, right? There was no paid stuff, but all organic. But that was quite straightforward. So most states, every single state, when it created a new market, they would issue 20 lab licenses, let's say, and then probably about half of them would contact us. And that gave us this really, really sort of nice starting point. We did a lot of in-person field sales, traveling around, got a lot of MRs across the states, had some really crazy stories of trying to go to labs who didn't want to talk to us and getting chased off their property with a guy with a gun, those kinds of things.
Amazing.
But,
Amazing.
A lot of fun.
That's cool. And then in 2021, you left and came to the UK and started basically brainstorming, right? And then I remember you mentioned you were looking to get another co-founder, right? Because working with a co-founder is, let's say, easier, not as boring, lots of, let's say, mental support. How did you go about, finding a good co-founder?
Yeah, so I actually I started a data warehousing. It was sort of more a project than a business, because it was very much in the sort of customer interview space and ideation space. And actually, I worked through the sort of Y Combinator co-founding platform to find Edward, who I worked with that project. But actually, we got introduced through Y Combinator in the end. There was sort of someone somewhere on their end was like, "Hey, you guys should meet." And I also the interesting so finding co-founders is an incredibly important thing. There's a structure behind it these days. So there's this fantastic document, 50 questions, which I'm sure people can find if they Google it, and it's an incredibly high quality resource because what it does is it forces you to have these challenging questions quite early about the state of your life and how you think about attacking certain problems. The thing that it doesn't do brilliantly, which I think you need to go maybe a step further on, is to think about what your values are and then talk about those values from the perspective of how you might build a company together. And that's, I think, where things can become even trickier because it's not just a list of facts. It's about things like, what do you believe in? So I worked with Edward on that, and that was a really good project. We actually combined with another friend, Ian, and they're actually focused now on building this data lineage solution. And then I actually worked with another co-founder focused on the AI space a few months ago. He got a fantastic job offer, so we decided, couldn't really compete with that. He's now the head of growth at 11 Labs, which is, a really great business and is on the trajectory towards, multi unicorn. So that would have been probably a pretty good partnership, but I didn't really progress his opportunity to go build that business. So for me, that journey has always been very open-minded, very values-driven, focused on these questions, but also quite a high threshold. It's a bad idea to work with a co-founder unless you're very committed, very driven, unless you believe in the product that you're building, you understand the audience that you're building for. And I actually happened to have spent a few months advising a friend of mine who's going through a very rough co-founder divorce, which sadly has now led to that business being shut down and the money returned because it just couldn't get out of this co-founder battle. So because of that, for me, it's made more sense now to focus on being a solo founder, even though at the point you made it is a good idea to find people that you can sort of share the burden with. Yeah, so that the process really now, I think, is, meet as many people as you can. The Y Combinator co-founding platform is a great way to do it. Do the 50 questions and then collaborate with somebody over 3 to 4 weeks, build something, have deadlines and deliveries and things that you can actually test each other on and make sure that your values are in the same place. But then if you get to that point, then, don't look back and make sure that you're, strapped in for the ride, because founding a company is it's a long slog. It takes a long time and there's iteration, there's pain along the way. And to have someone to share it with is very important. So, I definitely recommend going through the journey, even if maybe you decide not to pair it with anybody.
Yeah, awesome. And then you stumbled across ThinkChain, right? Basically, I guess like one thing led to another, and then you found this really interesting use case for the private equity and hedge fund industry. I guess let's say, how did it happen, and what does the product do now?
Yeah, there was an important starting point, which was we built a product called Gen4's GenChat, which is basically a WhatsApp tool that could summarize PDFs. So the interesting thing for me, and I think that a lot of this AI space, I think, in my view at least, makes sense to try and think of from the ground up, is that because it's a new technology, don't think, certainly not a year ago, I think still even now, the idea of being AI first as a product, I think is quite an open question, which means that it makes sense to give people something to determine whether or not they are getting value out of it, and then to learn a bit more about what that value is, right? So basically, launch the product, PDF summarization on WhatsApp with follow-up questions. So you can send in the PDF, you get the summary, and then you can sort of do a deep dive. It's all AI driven. WhatsApp is a very powerful tool to use for that because obviously the UI is free, right? So it's just a backend API, quite a simple product. But what that did was it started to open out all these different use cases. And actually, there's a whole range of things. So the product it's really successful in Kenya, have thousands of users in Kenya. Lots of them are students. Lots of them are working in medicine. So I think some are doctors. And what's interesting is that there seems to be this sort of flow where people in Kenya like to use WhatsApp rather than other web applications, like as in other mobile apps. they get a lot of documents, and their sort of ease and the sort of flow that they go through for the kinds of questions that they need to ask works really well as a WhatsApp product. There's no way I would have known that without launching it and shipping it, right? But having said that, it wasn't for me the right thing to focus on to sort of build something that I really understood and knew well. What I had on the other side was real estate investors, and real estate investors using the product to basically upload things like leases, development documents, IMs, and things like that. And then to try and make sense of whatever it was that they were putting up. And actually, some of them got very complicated. So there were documents which had to be OCR'd, documents in different languages, which was really interesting as well. Because it's obvious now, but back in April, when people were sort of uploading Polish documents, it was like, oh yeah, that's amazing. This is something which you can really use AI for, because it's automatic translation. But the fact that it can come up with a summary and then questions on something from this document is like that completely changes your workflow. So that basically sort of led to different things. And then what became interesting at that point was that I have a lot of friends who work in private equity, real estate, family offices, very, like holding companies, lots of different kinds of professional investors. And investors receive documents as a flood, right? So they receive lots and lots of weird things in batches. And they come all the time. So you get sent pitch decks, but also you get sent much more complicated sets of information. So then the real question became matching the workflow of the user to the kinds of documents that they were getting. We came up, there's a few different innovations within the platform which sort of help that flow. We have this concept of building memos, and in particular this idea that the memo essentially is a part of this journey that you go on with an AI to get to an end use. So in other words, you start with all this unstructured data across lots of PDFs. It's great. You can ask questions, but where do all the answers go? And the idea is that you kind of build up this knowledge base in and around. So that's really what ThinkChain is. It's a platform which is a deal evaluation platform using lots of random source information from all over the place, building up deal memos, doing actual financial modeling, and then coming out with an AI perspective, and then using that to help you make good investment decisions. And these are the kinds of things also which help with things like hallucinations, which can happen because you source everything, you take everything back to sort of the underlying materials, and things like thread ambiguity, which is another problem. Some issues around retrieval work, which is another complexity. These are all AI specific solutions, specific problems which didn't exist 18 months ago, but now they're incredibly important because every AI platform out there is trying to solve the same things. But this is how in our view you solve them, is through this kind of toolkit. The WhatsApp bot was a really important one because it basically pulled an actual use case out of the market rather than just doing lots of guesswork. And then from that, there was a great basis to do hundreds of interviews, and that's obviously how you find use cases.
Yeah. And so on the back end, you have, I guess, ChatGPT, and on the front end, you have WhatsApp. And I guess your technology is really about the use case and optimizing and, I guess, structuring the output in a way the professional investors don't need to change it too much, right? And I guess, like, in the long term, what you want to achieve is, of course, almost like be the first in the market, get a bunch of private equity shops signed up so they don't need to switch. But what is the, I guess, proprietary, like super hard to replicate element? Is there one?
So I think there's kind of an important concept in what the power is of this current generation of language models. So actually, first of all, just made the point. So the WhatsApp platform is a prototyping tool, but the main platform now is a web application. So the WhatsApp platform is basically kind of parallel to it. In the web application, you work with an interface which works with several different underlying models. So ChatGPT / GPT-4 primarily is just one of the various different things that inject into the product. So we actually, broadly speaking, the aim is to be language model independent. So we actually alternate across Anthropic, Llama 2, and GPT-4. But the main reason why we do that, to be honest, is because there are rate limits on most platforms, and there's unpredictable content filtering. So it actually makes sense to, as much as possible, be able to use lots of different models, lots of different deployments, lots of different endpoints. But then there's also a few different other things on the foundational model side which are relevant. So, for instance, pulling data out of documents is something which isn't just a language model challenge. And there's also this concept of vectorizing that data, storing it in different places, chunking it up, making it available for retrieval. But the actual thing is that so obviously the primary thing that a language model does is you send it text and it sends you text back. ChatGPT launched the Functions API, which is a different structure of endpoint, which is designed to send back structured data. But actually, in lots of ways, Functions API is quite limiting and isn't necessarily the best way to build something useful. The way that we think about it is whenever a language model replies to anything, it describes what it's doing, which is valuable for the quality of the response increasing. So if you force the response to be really small, the accuracy goes down. Whereas if there's a bigger response with some contextual description, the accuracy goes up. But also what it can do within that response is basically create a transformation. And the transformations can be applied to anything. Doesn't really matter what it is that you want to apply it to. Actually, those transformations can be done through Python code execution. And that Python code execution can be done through any Python library that you might want to do, including Python libraries that you write yourself. We were lucky as well that we got early access to GPT-4, so GPT-4 fine-tuning. So because of that, we have fine-tuned versions of GPT-4, which relate specifically to Python libraries that we've written, which then give you transformation of some underlying source, whatever it might be, which can be action or it can be content, whatever it might be, which then give you an output that's useful. So that's how we see applying. What it means is like, it's definitely true that we use GPT-4. Some people argue that if you use GPT-4, then you'll just wrap on GPT-4 and there's nothing else happening. That really isn't true, and it's very quickly becoming much less and less true because everybody who's building behind a use case is becoming more and more tailored. And it's not just about some prompt engineering, it's all these other layers, and that's what really makes these things easy. So that's why, for instance, you can talk to ThinkChain about a document. You can say, change paragraph number 4 to add 3 more opportunities coming from this document. It doesn't rewrite the whole document, it just gives you a transformation event. The transformation event just pops in with new text. And that kind of thing creates tailored functional use cases. And that's why I think the whole application. Now, to be fair, when AGI appears, a lot of the stuff is going away anyway. But I don't know what happens at that point. So new generations of AI are certainly something which is going to shift this productization.
Yeah. There's still time. There's still time. It's about being, just fast, getting a lot of clients right, and then trying to exit.
Well, no. So I mean, for me, I'm a great believer in the idea that if you can build a business model which iterates rapidly, then that allows you to do very interesting things down the line, whatever happens. And if you have an energized, focused team who know what they're trying to do, then I think that's where, because the big thing that's obviously happening is there's a huge disruptive technology which has suddenly been released, and it's going to disrupt pretty much everything. Most of the incumbents are not in a great position to apply it because their software is not really designed to be AI first. So some platforms may be slightly more than others. But what that means is we're talking about a wave of new things, especially as we get domain-specific LLMs, most of which will be created by the app layer, not by the foundational model builders. And what that's going to mean is that this whole thing is going to ripple through the whole. So, I mean, for me, it's all about basically finding a domain that you know really well, energized set of users who love the product and who have a real problem to solve, real urgency behind what they're trying to solve, and then basically building that and then living on top of everything else that happens. So, for instance, GPT-4 Vision wasn't a surprise exactly, but it's a new thing. Now you can ingest images, and obviously doing things like ingesting charts as images, which means that you can take a 500-page PDF and you can make that structured and useful. That's a big deal, but that was really just a question of waiting for the new tech to new foundation model, slide it in. And every time a new model comes out, the Anthropic's 200K model came out, just slide it in. That's a new model that we can use for a use case, and then just keep doing that, really.
So now, previous episode, we had the founder of Prosapient. And I don't know if you know Prosapient, right? They raised 10 million Series A and got to 40 million revenues as an expert network tech platform. And their customer audience was very similar to yours, actually. It was private equity funds, hedge funds, and a lot of the consultants, right? And a lot of the first customer acquisition was done through Jordan's network. And ultimately they then, of course, started partnering up with other people and institutions. But ultimately, they still grew through a lot of direct outreach because the universe of customers was finite, right? It was big, but it was finite. So, are you approaching it in a similar way, right? You obviously mentioned you have a great network. Is it just like right now you pinging people, hey, can you be a beta tester? If you like it, sign up and pay. Or are you planning to also run, I don't know, for example, LinkedIn ads? I could see it work potentially, right? Account-based marketing, but targeting, managing directors in private equity firms, etc. Or is it all going to be, direct sales at the moment and, email outreach or WhatsApp outreach, but like
Yeah, I mean,
targeting?
it's a great question. I basically answer with two different buckets of things, right? So one of the buckets is how do you find people as a whole? Definitely, network has been an important starting point. Um, so I have several different sort of network groups, which I found very useful. Obviously, we chatted about YPO in the past. There's a group called VAB as well, which is a really high quality networking group. I use LinkedIn a lot, and there's a few different ways. I don't pay for LinkedIn ads yet, although actually probably will be starting that in a few weeks. There's a product called Meet Alfred that I use for LinkedIn outbound. There's several different similar services, um, and what I found is so for a company like ours, we don't want to onboard too many people at a time anyway. So
Mm-hmm.
we actually essentially only allocate. At the moment, it's really like it's a couple of people every, let's say, 3 weeks. But the velocity which one gets you really is going to be a couple of people a week. And that's when I say a couple of people. There's the way we split it is that there's going to be a decision maker and a user. Or ideally, we would know both the decision maker and the user. The user has to want it rather than being forced to use it. The decision maker has to be excited about it. But at the moment, of course, everyone's excited about AI, so it's not that hard to find people. But that's when we get into the second bucket, which is it's very important with this kind of product to filter for interest and excitement. Like I almost don't really want to have to sell it too much because if you get to a point where someone says things like oh I don't I could just do that with a different tool, then probably the answer is at the stage is like you should just use that different tool because I'm worried if I give it to you, you'll just use the other tool and you won't try and be energized and excited about it. If you don't quite get it, that's fine, and maybe we're not quite there yet. But I have 5 other people who definitely get it, and those are the people I'm going to focus on right now because they're more likely to use it and give feedback. So I think that's really where the focus is for. I think pretty much this is one of the big learnings of doing B2B sales in my last business and just sort of generally talking to users as they become onboarded into something is there's always a difference between the user and the decision maker. You need both to be on board really. The user has to feel the pain and for us the pain is like how many data rooms do you see a month? What do they look like? Are they useful? Are they well structured? And the answer was always no, they're a nightmare. But some people are like, well, I only see one every couple of months. My deal flow isn't that big. Great,
Mm-hmm.
not the best fit, right? Where someone's like, oh my God, I've got so many data rooms. And there was one of them, I probably would have spent more time on it, but I just didn't have enough of an opportunity. I had too many things happening. Perfect. And then it's even better if someone says, look, I used ChatGPT, but it didn't quite work for me. Perfect. So you have the energy behind it. You know AI can help, but it wasn't quite the right fit. I think that's part, it's a counterintuitive thing to say, but you have to at times say no to potential customers because it's very obvious that they're not going to give you quite what you need. Now, at a certain point, that kind of changes, and if you have the scale of a sales team and you have more onboarding people, then you can put people into a funnel and you can train them and you can have some presentation materials and you can double check and you can triple check.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, if you're doing that too early, then most likely you're just focused on the wrong thing. Now, it could be true that you haven't solved the use case, and that's a different problem. But if you know that you've solved it because some people are getting sort of great value out of it, then that gives you an opportunity to be quite selective about who you work with. And it also, I mean, for us, it can be quite a big deal because, I mean, also, while a lot of infrastructure is scalable, when you're working with sort of vector databases and things like that, you don't necessarily want to put thousands of people into it at once because there's just too much happening. It does make more sense to give people a really great experience. So, 2 a week, are you going to be using this by next Monday? Sign the LOI. Let's have a conversation about what is your expectation going to be? Let's match it to what the product does at the moment. Okay, you expect that. That's great. That's a great idea. It's not in the product at the moment. So you have to wait for that feature, but this feature is there. You can use it all the time. and then sort of really building and iterating around that. So yeah, so network driven, mainly outbounds and conversations, going to events and talking to people, trying to form that kind of relationship, and then being somewhat selective about the people who we work with, and looking for that energy and positivity and engagement. But then when we find that, it's normally a really great process.
And I guess in terms of challenges, I mean, do you see the usage and the activity level of the right customers increasing, or do you also see some people, they try it a few times, they're excited, and then they stop using it?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that we've had a few different sort of launches and different sort of iterations of the product, which means that we've had, you know, the first version was fairly similar to ChatGPT in the sense that it's mainly a conversational thread with an AI without sort of much that you're sort of engaging with alongside it. And actually, the most loyal user of that version is my wife, who loves it. She uses it instead of ChatGPT, which is great. But the sort of use case driven stuff was always likely to lead to a, you know, maybe I like it, maybe I don't. It's not amazing. I mean, actually, earlier versions of the product, we were very focused on voice and video, and we built some stuff which I think will come back later, but decided to retire it for now because I don't think that voice and video is really the best usage of this generation of AI. It doesn't. I mean, everyone by this point has had verbal conversations with ChatGPT because they obviously introduced it into the mobile app as well. It's fine, but it's not groundbreaking. It's more of an interesting thing rather than a useful thing. But that's the kind of iteration which you do and you build, and then people can see it. And is it good? Is it not? It's not really a use case, and sort of move away from it. But yeah, so in terms of the core use case that we're really focused on, which is large data rooms, lots of documents, understanding them rapidly. The thing about that is nothing really else does that. So if you need that, then it's not that hard of a sell. It's like, yeah, now the sudden is the best way to do this. And that's only going to get better, right? So the more, I find it really fascinating that there's quite a lot of business models over the past decade or so, and what they've been focused on is trying to normalize deals. And trying to do things like getting startup founders to type their metrics into a consistent sheet so that an investor can see all the same things at the same time. And the thing is that businesses hate that because they don't like having their KPI structure defined by a platform, and they have other stuff to do with their days. Whereas if instead a startup founder or a growth equity level seller is basically just like, here's a data room. I appreciate it's very messy, but this is everything from an investor perspective. That's really great if they have a way to handle that information. And that's what AI is amazing at, because it will read everything for you, structure everything for you, and then give you an output. It doesn't matter what the source is. So it's kind of like the world has been trying to force sellers to be consistent, but that's not always going to happen, particularly if the seller has a great business and just knows it's valuable. They're not going to type things into a consistent format, so they're not going to use those solutions. Whereas the buyers, they just want to get the documents. And that's where I feel like AI kind of plays really nicely, and a lot of the solutions which have appeared in the past 10 years or so probably don't quite fit the market.
Yeah, and I mean, it would be really useful. Like back in my days, I would love to have a tool like that for sure. So let's maybe move to another topic, which is fundraising. And obviously for the medical cannabis software, you raised quite a lot at a very, very high valuation, given the hype and the sentiment back then. The world changed multiple times since, only in one direction. And so how did you think about fundraising this time? And you obviously now raised your, I guess, pre-seed. And then how do you think about like raising the next round if you need to?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. And I honestly think that there's this important mindset, which is that there actually is a deep and liquid market for certain kinds of companies, which will always exist, right? So, once you get to, so the final stage is, once you get to, having EBITDA minus CapEx, that you're going to put a nice multiple on that, and there's certainty that the business is worth that. But even before that, there are early stages where, getting to a sensible revenue multiple is something which you can do fairly easily. Now, the market prior to that, the idea stage market, has completely changed. And it's changed in a very strange way, because it hasn't gone away, but it's not consistent. which means that you still see people raising very nice seed rounds often with like nothing, no traction and no anything. But those people are more like, it's this concept of survivorship bias, right? You observe somebody doing that. That doesn't mean that there's much depth behind that. And there's always people who have like a cheat code of some kind. They have a friend here or they have a thing here, whatever it might be, which opens it out for them. Now, unfortunately, I do have quite a deep network of investors, and there's a whole sort of universe out there who are sort of available to be raised from, most of whom I'm very well connected to. But there's a time sink problem, right? Because the problem basically is, what you really want to do for a fundraising round is get your ducks in a row, go to lots and lots of people, churn through all of them, and then you're going to get a lot of no's, but you're going to get, 20% yeses, and that's enough to do your round. Now that right now has gone down from 20% to big question mark. And it's the kind of question mark which can be incredibly damaging, because it's the kind of thing which leads to you wasting 2, 3, 4 months, on something which is much lower success rate than it should be given the sort of risk distribution. And that can put you in quite a bad position. But because the long-term market still exists, basically if you have revenue, if you have traction, if you have growth, you have all these things that everybody wants in business that they're looking for, then you don't have to worry so much about the big question mark, right? You're much more focused at that point, like, well, I have $1 million of revenue, and so that means the business is, for sure, as long as it's growing, it's going to be worth 20 million. I mean, that's quite a low valuation in historic terms. It's quite a high valuation actually compared to what some businesses with $1 million of revenue are worth. But that kind of market is still pretty robust and pretty much there. So what it means is you need to forget about relying on round after round of seed level pitching and focus much more on how do you get past those levels into something which is more substantial. But of course, the other interesting thing is, because AI has changed a lot about how quickly you can build things, about how you can work with, engineers, you can work with a team of engineers, how much you can sort of build without a team of engineers. What that means is that the ability to get to traction and revenue is quite different to where it was before. Like essentially what it's saying is, before you probably had to raise like $1 million or $2 million to build a pretty good enterprise product. Now you can do that on $500,000 or 250K. And because of, and also actually because there's fewer startups, there's much less competition for this stuff as well. And actually a lot of people who have raised that sort of 2 to 3 million, round at like a 20 cap, they're under a lot of pressure because the later rounds are not really there and the valuations are not there anymore. So what it means is that actually, crisis breeds opportunity, right? And opportunity is move quickly towards something which doesn't need VC money. But then once you've got that, guess what? The VC market will be there, because if you're getting past the idea stage, when you have this proof points, have this traction, then there's a whole different market out there for you. So from our perspective, we have enough money to mean that we have no urgency on raising. We're not going to spend a bunch of time, with a pitch deck going around to lots of people who are likely either to say no or to take week after week after week to come back with terms, and we'll see where it goes. The thing I would say is Series A round has always been one of the hardest rounds to raise. That's always been true. But it's also true that once you get to that point in that trajectory, particularly if you're not too diluted as a founder, then there's at that point you're obviously building scaling sales teams, you're building sort of onboarding experiences, that kind of stuff. You've already solved the problem. That's a very different kind of business, and that market is still there. The valuations are much lower, but the money is there, right? There's plenty of VC money available for that kind of thing. At least there is at the moment. Obviously, that's going to slow down a bit because the fundraising cycle is quite quiet. But getting to that point is the target, right? And that was always the target, and it's still the target. But actually, getting to there with less resources is easier than it's ever been. So that's why I think the mindset needs to shift. It's like, stop thinking about the world as idea stage fundraising, and start thinking about it like, well, there's a later stage which is there and is targetable and is achievable. So get to that stage and do it however you can.
Yeah, you can change a few letters in the alphabet when you raise, basically.
It's always amazing,
right? Jump a few letters, right?
It's a strange. I mean, the whole idea is particularly so. My experience is very transatlantic, and the numbers and the valuations and the structures are so different for a UK deal versus a US deal. I mean, they're basically completely independent markets.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like this idea of what is an A anyway.
100%. So before we go into the quick fire questions, in terms of lessons, right? What could you share with other SaaS founders out there in terms of the biggest lesson you had?
Yeah, so we've obviously talked mainly on this about sort of earlier stage stuff. I always think that one of my most important lessons is much more about sort of later stage company building. So I'm a great believer in values being at the center of how you build a
Mm-hmm.
company. I'm a great believer in high self-confidence but low ego. You know, a few friends who have these kind of posters of like, you know, we don't work with ourselves, that kind of thing, which I agree with. Like, it's all about sort of fitting into this sort of culture where people can achieve lots of things and are high in terms of aspiration, but
Mm-hmm.
they're not rude about it and they're not sort of, you know, annoying about it. For me, I think that one of the most important things about values is when you're working with a team, when you're helping somebody who is, you know, works for you, works within your organization. I think it's very important to think about that person's career independently of the organization that you're running. So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically like saying, you know, if you have somebody who's an incredible resource and works really hard, does amazing things, sure, you should promote them, pay them well, all of that kind of stuff. But you should actually think about their career much more broadly than your business. Some people find that kind of intuitive because it means that that person's more likely to leave. For instance, if you fund their training and you help them with their networking, you get them on podcasts and things like that. But the reality is that what you're actually doing is you're sort of building this community of people who sort of, you know, believe in a shared future and are espousing the values of the company much more widely than just within your, you know, four walls. And they're also going to bring a lot of the skills that they get from outside and bring them back internally. They may well leave at a certain point and get other jobs, but it's actually interesting the way that a lot of people who leave might well come back, right? They get a job
Yeah.
somewhere else, and the values and the culture of the company that they join aren't quite as nice as they thought it would be. Maybe the salary was high, but maybe it's quite cutthroat and there's people being fired much more frequently. And then what you end up with is this kind of community. So basically, what I would say is, you know, when you hire people and when you work with a high quality team, you should try and build their career so that they can leave. Not try and sort of make it focused just around the company that you're building. That kind of stuff just kicks back fourfold, fivefold for the company that you're building.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really
and I mean,
interesting.
this is less
Yeah.
true in the UK, but like in the
Mm-hmm.
US, there's this idea of like, you know, the PayPal mafia, right? Because loads of people went through PayPal and then built other businesses.
Yeah.
Revolut's quite famous for that in the UK.
Yeah,
But that's, I mean,
absolutely.
that
Like,
kind of culture. It's a,
yeah, yeah, like, yeah, building like these tribes. And yeah, absolutely. We do something where we really encourage members of the team to really like push their own LinkedIn really hard and create content. So everybody has their mini brand as well. Because it's ultimately it's also about authority, and everybody should have their own brand to then be even